Today on the podcast, we've got José Ricón. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, that's more or less right.
More or less right. Okay. Anyway, how are you doing today, José?
Great, thank you. It's great to be here.
So, José, I just wanted to get started. Could you give us kind of a brief background bio and just tell us the name of your blog so people know where to go?
Yes, so I blog at this website called nintil.com, and I blog about various topics over the years. More recently, I've been writing about science, or the way science works, which what some people call Metascience, and that in my corner of the internet we like to call progress studies. And I've also been writing about some specific aspects of one particular kind of science, that is longevity research and aging. I've also been writing about that. And in the past, I've written about economic history. In particular, I wrote this very long series of blog posts about the Soviet Union and its economy.
That's great. That's super. And I might end up asking you about longevity. I didn't put anything in the outline,
sure.
But I missed that one. So I just wanted to go ahead and get started with, should we fund people or projects in science? So we had Don Braben on a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about scientific freedom and how things have kind of gone wrong. So at a super high level, people, projects, which are more important? VCs go back and forth on this all the time, and that's for companies. But in science, which are more important?
Well, I guess the lazy answer, although it's kind of correct, is one of those. but
right.
But to give a bit more context, and maybe we could start with what Braben is saying. So he, for example, has this idea of the Planck Lab. This is Max Planck and other Einstein and other bright physicists from the 20th century that largely they were not funded by grants in the modern sense. They were just funded by universities. They had tenure effectively, and they could do research on whatever they wanted. They didn't have to justify themselves periodically to maintain their status, and so they could, just as the theory goes, they could think very long term and pursue whatever it is that they wanted to without being worried that, in 5 years I need to produce a piece of research to actually get the next grant and so on and so forth. Now, Braben doesn't say that all science has to be like that. And maybe initially it seems that that's what he's saying, but rather he's saying that we should go more in that direction. But Braben is saying that for a specific kind of science, that is for breakthrough science or science that it's difficult to evaluate at first, the fund people approach might be the right one. There might be other reasons why. So the key reason for this is that suppose that, let's say, the next Einstein comes to you and says, I just want to fumble around and think about physics and what is time, right. what is light. These very philosophical, seeming weird questions. As in, he doesn't tell you, I'm going to just fix this equation a little bit, or I'm going to invent a new cancer drug. And he's like, I just want to think about physics, or maybe we will somewhere not. That would be very strange in today's funding environment. And what Braben would say is that if we don't have a place for people like Einstein or people that will be funded, that will be better suited for this fund people model, then we will be missing out on lots of very interesting ideas.
And it seems like when we talked to Don, his big idea was like, used to be, you could, if you were Max Planck and you wanted to work on thermodynamics for 20 years, you could get a small amount of money and you could just work on that for a long time. It wasn't, in other words, there wouldn't be a ton of money, but it would be enough to keep you going and kind of pursue your passions. And this is really important for basic research and creativity.
Yeah, in Planck, so in Planck's own case, my last post was, incidentally, I looked at Planck's history. So Planck is most famous for the idea of the quantization of energy. This is the idea that energy, they're like small packets of energy, the famous quanta. And this can be used to explain, for example, the radiation spectrum of a black body at a given temperature, that otherwise the equation doesn't really fit with we're assuming that doesn't fit with actual observed data. So Planck got his PhD around 1879.
Oh wow!
But the thing is, if you look at most bibliographies of Planck and things that he published, you find that his most famous work, these papers about quantization of energy, were from the 1900s. That is indeed, so when Braben says 20 years, it refers to these 20 years from PhD to doing interesting recognized work. Now, right. Planck did actually publish stuff in between. He was not just thinking. He was published, but the stuff he published about is so obscure that no one really paid attention to it, and it's not even in English. It's just you have to learn German and go back to his obscure papers. But they exist, they are there. It's just that if you were to judge Planck, let's say 10 years into his career, you would would you say, oh, this guy is not going anywhere? Kind of like and yet, had you done that, you might have missed out on the 10 years after. Actually, he got to a very interesting point.
Absolutely, where he actually makes real progress.
Yeah. Now it has to be said that it's not like he was thinking on the same problem for 20 years. He was exploring various areas up until he found a very interesting problem to work on. So I guess in the more pessimistic case, the current system would have pushed Planck towards more safe and established areas of research. But you could conceive of another case where Planck actually gets grants to do quote safe work, but on the side he's actually doing and thinking about the interesting stuff. And indeed, this is what happens. There's this very interesting blog post that my friend Alexei Guzi wrote. I think it's what's the name of his blog post? How life sciences actually work. And he describes this. He interviewed a bunch of scientists, and this is what they do. They will ask for a grant to do X, but actually they will do something else. They will do the actual thing they were said they would do, but on the side with some money, they will do their thing they actually want to do, and as a side thing, which is not ideal in that ideally the system will be aligned with the researcher, but it's an interesting workaround for this kind of if you want to still experiment within the system.
Right. Well, and it does seem like, I've seen this a lot with my friends. I have a lot of friends that are research scientists, and RFP comes out and it's like, well, how can I fit my research into this RFP? There's got to be a way, right? And if you're a good salesperson scientist, you can make that happen. My worry though is if you're weird and you've got these different ideas, it's hard, and you're not a good salesperson, you end up getting cut out. And I wonder if the best people, you end up kind of specializing. You're either a good salesperson or you're a good scientist, and we've kind of selected that out of the equation.
Yeah, there's this very funny anecdote from I think he was the research director at the Rockefeller Foundation, I think perhaps prior around World War II. I don't know if it was before or after, but basically he wrote this brief handbook that he would use to train new analysts coming to the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation is the place that pioneered the fund people not projects approach. So these days people usually associate the idea with a huge medical institute, but the Rockefeller Foundation was also doing this kind of thing where like very hands-on, lots of interviews, get to know the researcher, actually even going to their houses to have dinner with them, just going to their labs, and really getting very personal with the scientists to really see if they actually deserve the funding. So in this book, he tells this anecdote of this guy that he tells it's like very, very bright person, the smartest chemist I know, but like he doesn't wear shoes and like he smells weird and he's a very strange person. Like he would never collaborate with anyone or and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Which is like, and it's like, and he said like he wouldn't fund this person in meaning that to some extent science also requires, or in some contexts science requires some of these, even back then, some of these salesmanship techniques and fitting into the system.
Exactly.
That maybe it's the case that some people require individualized lifelong funding to their weird thing. I guess one example would be this the surfer physicist Garrett Lisi. He's in Hawaii surfing and doing physics research on his own on this theory of everything he's thinking about. And that's
right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So it seems like it's kind of this interplay. So what is the Haldane Principle? Do you know how to pronounce it? I don't know. I've just read the Wikipedia entry.
Yeah, so the Haldane Principle is an idea probably an idea or value to inspire how science should be organized, and more or less what it states, and this seems to be a foundational principle in scientific organization and funding throughout the world, although this originates in the UK, is that scientists should decide what scientists do. Not necessarily, it's not necessarily that I should decide my own research, but my peers should judge me, and scientific funding should be allocated with input from scientists. That is that societal needs should not directly impose or constrain the research. This is kind of controversial for various reasons, because plausibly society is funding scientists. I think, lots of science is done privately, but a lot of it, especially basic science, is publicly funded by taxation, ultimately. So ultimately, scientists are accountable to society in what they do. And scientists, they are not being paid to have fun and think about nature. They are being paid to produce. This is another interesting philosophical question. What is science for? What as society are we asking of scientists? Are we asking them to produce knowledge, or are we asking them to produce useful knowledge that can be used for inventions? And my bet is that probably smarter people, or people that are probably closer to making decisions around science, are biased towards the science for the sake of science, or knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I mean, like me personally, I personally like to learn about like, this galaxy black hole thing. Would that be useful for like having faster cars? Probably not, but it's cool to know. Now, do most people care about those things relative to putting the money, let's say, on energy research or cancer research?
Right.
So it's kind of it's kind of tricky, and of course politically it's kind of difficult to say, okay, we're going to cut your budget, your string theories, because we need to put this money on cancer research. And it seems that that bargain was achieved back then, whereby scientists said, okay, if we're going to do it ourselves, just like politicians wouldn't like meddle in that. And that has been like a debate back and forth over the years, as in to what extent should science govern itself, or whether science is too important to be left to a scientist, and that we should actually impose more structure from the outside.
Right. And this reminds me, I'm in the middle of a book. It's by, do you know who General Groves was?
Yes, the Manhattan Project guy.
He ran the Manhattan Project. So he wrote a book about the experience, which is quite good. And I really like East Tennessee. So, it's all about how he selected the site, and he's, building all this infrastructure. And it's fascinating to me because he knows very generally how the science works. But what he really knows is how to get things done. And so, he's shoving these scientists into these, he's like, I know you have these pet projects you love, but that's not what you're working on anymore.
Yeah, he was an Army guy, right?
That's right. He was Army Corps of Engineers, brigadier general. And it's really interesting, like how he selected Oppenheimer. Like the intelligence agencies didn't want Oppenheimer because he was a socialist. Groves is like, this is the best guy. I don't care what you say. In the entire book, if there's any takeaway, it's like, wow, there's something about kind of that two in the box leadership team where you've got the scientist, you've got this like extremely competent manager, and they're both making it work. So you have the technical lead and the managerial kind of business side lead. But it is interesting. So what do you think about that? Should it be scientists running all of this? Is it, Manhattan's a special case, right? Because we needed something there's a clear problem in a short time frame we needed it on. And we could speed it up like that in the short term.
Yeah. I think so I was mentioning earlier that whether or not we want funding projects or funding people, it depends on what you want. As in, if what you want is more or less well defined, let's say you want a nuclear bomb, or let's say you want a human genome, or you want a better microscope or whatnot, then it seems that it's easier to just define milestones and deadlines and do some project management on top of that, because ultimately the goal, as in, and more or less the distance from you are to the goal, and you can assess things more easily. And this, for example, was behind this idea that I don't know if you know Adam Marblestone.
No.
Well, so he's working at Schmidt Futures now. He used to work at DeepMind, and prior to that, he was working with George Church and Ed Boyden on mapping the brain and other things.
Oh wow!
And he has this idea of focused research organizations. The idea here being that there is a missing gap in the same way that you could argue that we need more fun people. We need to, for example, the physicist Liz Molin says that we only need to fund like 200 of the best physicists and just leave them alone. And with only those 200, like there aren't enough people that you want to give that funding to, but you just set them aside and let them do crazy stuff. Marblestone says we also need to do that for projects as well. We need to find there is an intermediate scale of projects that is they're kind of like mini Manhattan projects that could create benefit science, but that cannot be done in the usual academic context, because they either require too much money or they require managerial and organizational skills that are more common in, let's say, startups or regular corporations. I guess an example of an FRO in the Marblestone sense would be either the Manhattan Project itself, or more recently, Neuralink. Neuralink, ultimately, what they did was to take the state of the art across different parts of the BCI world, and then they packaged them together and solved a bunch of integration problems they had, and that's it. They didn't create a new paradigm of BCI or any the objective was clear, the technology was there. You just needed the last push to go commercial. So the idea here is that that there is also, besides funding people, there are also projects that are worth funding, and that will also be really good for science.
Gotcha. That's interesting. So it seems like you've got do you remember the Rumsfeld speech? He's like the known unknowns, known knowns.
Yeah, known unknowns, yeah.
So I like to think about science funding like that. So there's some things, we kind of know they exist, and we could see like an achievable roadmap. And then there's things we just don't know much about at all that maybe some curious people are interested in, and they need to be funded somehow. And then there's super concrete things, and there's this whole range, and you kind of need to make sure each area is well taken care of, or because if you don't have any basic research, eventually where are you going to get your tech from? in real application. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes, but also vice versa. So there is this idea in the economics of innovation, that's the so-called the linear model. This is the idea that you have basic research that feeds into applied research, and then from the applied we get into applications. But sometimes it's the case that applied research or tools or engineering is necessary to do the basic research. So for example, as an example, if you don't have a microscope, you cannot see small things, right? So for example, it could be that to do more basic research, you need, let's say, new data sets, new tools to actually go back in a loop to the basic research.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So it's all, there's a ton of interplay. There's a ton of interplay.
Yeah, it's like the conspiracy theorists like to say everything is connected. I think that's
That's right.
There is something. One more thing I guess I wanted to say here.
Yeah.
That people have there are various what we may call philosophical or conceptual arguments, or perhaps even with some math you can do some modeling about funding people or projects. But actually going and measuring whether or not funding people or projects works, it's extremely difficult. And I guess in one of my blog posts on, I think the first one on this Fund People and Project series, I looked at the experience of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and to what extent, because in the life science research context, the NIH in the US, National Institutes of Health, they typically fund concrete proposals. They do so for 5 years, 4 years-ish, and they do it in a relatively impersonal way. You submit your proposal, and then a committee reviews the proposal, and then they don't meet you, and they don't know who you are necessarily. Maybe they see your name, but whereas the HHMI, they fund you, they actually get personal with you, they meet you in person, they discuss your abroad but relatively open-ended research program, and they will fund you for 7 years with relatively more or less commitment to another 7 years unless you really fuck up. So you get effectively 14 years of support from HHMI to actually not just think of the next 5 years, but to have a 14-year planning horizon. And this paper tried to see, okay, these researchers that get this award, indeed, they actually do produce better research, but better, this is another question, better measured by high impact citations and things like that, which may or may not correlate with actually being useful. At this time, scientists will cite it. But is this because they were really good to begin with?
Right. This is crazy selection bias.
Exactly. Or is this because the extra time and budget they get enables them to do those things? The authors try to do some clever econometrics to control for this. I think the results are not as clear as they make them seem. And I think that if I have one thing to say or one thing to add to the conversation around science that hasn't been stressed enough, is that we need more experiments. We need more randomization. We need foundations to just allocate money at random and YOLO a little bit more instead of just doing one thing to see exactly how it works.
I love that. I love that approach, because that does seem really important, because we don't know a ton about. It seems like we don't know a ton about metascience, and I haven't read deeply enough to know, but it seems like there's a lot more to learn. Yeah,
I think there are various camps and schools of thought within metascience. Some people will say peer review is the worst and it sucks in general.
Yeah, Don's oh God, peer review, take it out back and shoot it.
I think it was in your podcast where Don says that for a lot of science, peer review can work more or less fine. It is for breakthrough science but some people take it even further. It's all peer review, it's kind of not great. Or people will say, no, actually, peer review is fine. Peer review kind of works. Or people will argue, we should fund scientists by lottery. We should just give money at random because we don't know what works.
No idea what to do.
It's there are various layers of epistemic nihilism that you can go into. It's we don't know anything about the world. And it's rationally, if you think that you know nothing, the rational thing to do is a uniform prior. You find everything equally, right? You don't have any reason to. It's I guess my view is that there are some things that seem at least intuitive more clear than others. So, for example, if we truly believe that we know nothing about who is going to be doing more interesting, useful science, we would fund cancer research with the same amount of money as we would fund Egyptologists or people that are studying ancient Sanskrit. Which I have nothing against Sanskrit scholars, but it's just that societally it seems that the people want more cancer cures and not as much Sanskrit scholarship.
Right, and I think that's common sense, right?
Yes, although it's also true that indeed, and has happened historically, there was one one interesting discovery in the life sciences that occurred because people were studying mummification in Egypt, and they were studying the mummies and stuff. And so, sure, yes, in theory, yes, you can get discovery from the weirdest places that then translate to unexpected places. But I expect that if you find chemistry research, you will probably find more interesting chemistry findings.
Right, exactly. One would think so, right? One would hope so.
Yeah,
that's great. So before we move on, so I think your sub tagline on Twitter is "Make Science Great Again," which I love. Are there any other policy interventions you would suggest you would be thinking about, or anything you found that you find interesting that might help?
I mean, there is the experimentation side. There is also doing, I guess, more of this Marvelstonian focused research organization kind of things, as in, or rather doing so something that maybe it's missing. It's something that looks like a roadmap for a field that says that, let's say, that imagine some kind of website, let's say maintained by NSF or something like that, that says, here's where this field stands, here are the bottlenecks, here are the open questions.
Right.
That kind of provides an organizing and coherent story for the field to organize itself around. And plausibly, you could use that either to fund research on the bottlenecks or for people to think more about, okay, if we want to go here, let's say mapping the brain, there are all these different avenues that we could pursue, and maybe we could see that these 2 or 3 ones are being under researched, so maybe they're worth funding more. And an example of this might be with nuclear fusion research, that there are a bunch of open letters to Nature published around arguing that funders have been focusing too much money on 1 or 2 approaches to fusion that is an ITER at
it's like just tokamaks or something, like
yes,
or something like that.
And maybe there are 7 or 8 other projects or approaches to fusion that maybe work, and they were getting more funding back then. But then ITER came in. It came in partly as a U.S. Soviet Union collaboration thing for friendship and stuff, and to throw money behind some science. But maybe we should have funded in a more diverse way back then, or maybe had we had it more visible that actually there were other approaches there, maybe it wouldn't have been the case that if you want to be successful as a plasma physicist, you had to go into these kind of approaches. So this idea of road mapping and bottlenecks, that's something I think it should be there, some kind of a website kind of to organize science. Another crazy idea that I've been thinking about, this is more on because sure, I mean, there's like the easy things everyone says, like, oh, you could reduce, you could do some lotteries, you could reduce the amount of hours spent on grants, all the boring stuff everyone kind of already knows. But you could also pursue a project whereby you try to see to what extent you can transfer genius to other people, or rather, what is it about productive labs or important labs that makes them so good? Is it just that they're smart? I mean, it's like, even if they have smart people, plausibly many scientists are sufficiently smart to understand and come up with the ideas. I guess as an example, I guess in the concept of, let's say, prime factorization, it's simple to multiply two prime numbers and get a number. It's difficult to break a number into different primes. Similarly, it's easy for you or for us to understand relativity, more or less. It's difficult to come up with relativity in the first place. Right. Now, but which I guess implying that it's not that you cannot comprehend the theory, is that there is some creative spark that's missing. So then the question is there a way to organize or systematize creativity and breakthrough generation such that not only crazy people in interesting labs can do it, but it's more open to anyone, that this is like, suppose I give you a problem and then there's this rule set or frameworks to think through the problem, and that leads you to better insights about what research direction to pursue. And this is extremely understudied. There is an interesting book on this that is fairly obscure. What's the title? It's by this guy called Ruth Bernstein. The title of the book is it's called Discovering, Inventing and Solving Problems at the Frontiers of Scientific Knowledge. The book is out of print, but it talks about this idea. It's from 1989. It goes over this idea of thinking in frameworks about science and creativity and what make great researchers great, and to what extent can we learn from that.
Interesting. That's really interesting.
Having systematizing creativity, that because ultimately I think that science, sure, like there's like a money constraint and there's a resource constraint, but I think there is an idea constraint as well. And I think that unlocking or enabling people to have better ideas would be great. To what extent this can be done, we don't know, but I think trying it would be an interesting exercise that I would like to see.
Definitely, it's at least worth trying, right? Absolutely, that's super interesting, and I'll put the link to that book in the show notes. That's great. So that's actually a great kind of segue into Can you talk a little bit about the Great Stagnation, your thoughts around it? I know you've written a lot of good stuff on it that I've really enjoyed.
Yeah. So I guess introducing the idea of the Great Stagnation, the idea here is that if you look at charts of GDP growth and TFP growth, I'll explain in a moment what TFP is. But GDP, I guess we get an idea of what it is, right? It's economic growth in general, economic activity. The growth of that it historically has been flat through history. Then it speeds up greatly through the Industrial Revolution, and then something seemingly happens in 1970, and then it slows down. That is, if you look at median income in the US has been growing at a slower pace since then. So that is the Great Stagnation. Now, GDP growth, you can decompose it into three components in various economic models. These three components are capital, labor, and the rest. This literally, it's a residual in the model. That's how it works. You literally, you try to explain GDP, but by it's like, okay, how much of GDP is because we have more or better, more educated people working on the problem? How much of GDP is because we have more capital equipment, more tools, more stuff? And how much is unexplained? And the theorizing then goes that this unexplained stuff is what economists call total factor productivity, or productivity for short. This is not the same. And TFP has been kind of, again, growing at a slower pace since 1970. Now, the TFP emphatically is not technological innovation. TFP is a grab bag of everything else. So I guess it's a mixture, for example, institutional dysfunction and potentially technological slowdown, but also sectoral rebalancing. So mind you have two sectors in the economy. One has its productivity growing very fast, and another has its productivity growing very slowly. The sector in which you spend, in which productivity grows very fast, let's say that things become very cheap. Let's say for computers, now you can have a relatively cheap computer that can do a lot of things. So then you spend less on that, but then the other one relatively becomes more expensive. These sectors, and then basically at the end, your economy looks like the low production growth sector. It's bigger than the other one. Within each sector, productivity rates in this experiment they're growing at the same rate. So it happens that within the economy, the slow growth one is bigger. But because it's bigger, now it has a bigger impact. So now that slower growth in that bigger sector means that overall you get a slower growth in the economy. And the economy of the US and other countries has seen a shift from sectors in which it's easy to increase productivity, like manufacturing. I think the ultimate one-point trick we have to make things productive is the assembly line, is to modularize and make more of the thing. And yet the sectors that the economy is now more investing more or putting more money on are like people or personnel intensive services like healthcare, education. You could even count research to some extent. That is, you can plausibly, and Tesla seems to be doing this, you can produce cars, let's say, 2x faster. You cannot move your arms twice as fast in an assembly line as a human being. Like there are limits to human performance that constrain those. There are ways that we could pursue to overcome these. We could, for example, try to push more on automation or process improvements and other things. There are some interesting case studies of healthcare in India that there's a chain of hospitals that they have basically built a surgery assembly line where you have one surgeon doing the same operation over and over.
The expert comes in to do his one part of the heart surgery for just like a similar,
it's almost and then it goes on the same operation and controlling for labor costs. This is cheaper than the US model of surgery. And this thing is certified by a US healthcare quality institution. So it's kind of like US level of quality. So it's a very, very, very interesting example that maybe we can link to because it's quite surprising that this exists. So the great stagnation in terms of productivity and GDP is real, but from that does not follow that there is a stagnation or a great stagnation in technology, which is a different one. There might be. So but the thing is, it's difficult to measure, and TFP is not enough because we said it's a grab bag. I think I'm inclined towards the TFP nihilism view, where I think some people are more or less prone to jump from TFP to technology, and I'm not very keen on that. I like to take individual technologies and look at how they are developing over time. For example, if you take Moore's law or the increase of efficiency in nuclear reactors or in steam boilers or in construction speeds or any or in the costs of batteries and solar panels, all the trends you could possibly find, do these show a change around 1970? The answer is no. Some, I think one or two do, but there is nothing special that happens in 1970. which I think should give some people some pause about whether or not it's technology or not. Some people then argue that it's and actually I don't claim that just because this is the case, it means that science is not slowing down, because it could be that for established technologies, the ones you can actually measure and put in charts, those are doing fine, but we are generating less breakthroughs. And if we are doing so, then because ultimately for an established paradigm, you end up exhausting it. As an example, for nuclear reactors, one way to increase how much power you get out of an existing one, is to increase the capacity factor. This is a let's say that the nuclear plant generates 1 gigawatt, and if it's active for an hour, it's 1 gigawatt hour.
Right.
The capacity factor would be if you have 1 gigawatt plant and you have so many hours in a year, how many of those hours is actually on versus maintenance and other stuff. But capacity factors have been going up from like I think 70% back in the day, or 60 originally, to like 96% these days. So we have gotten better at operation and efficiency, and that alone can squeeze more energy out of the same exact plant.
Gotcha.
But 100%, it's limited by 100%.
Right.
Likewise, for internal combustion engines, there are some thermodynamical limits called the Carnot efficiency as to how much efficiency you can get out of this. But then you can paradigm shift and have electric motors, which don't have. Well, I mean, sure, at some level they're thermodynamically constrained, but the constraints are higher, so it's not as much of a problem. So I guess to wrap up, it's it's difficult to actually say yes or no to whether or not there is a technological stagnation. And my preferred answer to this is to say moo, or which is this requires maybe some explaining. So in Zen Buddhism, there is this thing known as the moo koan. So koans are these koans are these weird questions in Zen Buddhism that are meant to make you reflect about things. So this one goes like this. It goes: a monk asked Jiaoju Gongshen, Chinese Zen master, and the question was, has a dog Buddha nature or not? And the master Jiaoju answered Wu, or in Japanese Mu. Now, what does this mean? The meaning of this word is something like it can be translated as nothingness or emptiness or something like that. But the point is that he's trying to answer the question, or rather to say, you should not think about this question or try to say yes or no. You should actually focus on other questions, namely looking at everything that's broken as in why X field is not being faster, and focus on those problems and solving problems there. And I think that is an easier and more tractable and perhaps even more interesting or encouraging problem than trying to think what happened in 1970. Maybe the answer is that nothing happened. Maybe it's a bunch of trends that saw it happen that got us lower growth in 1970. But I say, even if we could get TFP looking like the GameStop stock is going vertical, even if we could do that, we could still keep asking the question, sure, TFP growth is now faster, hypothetically, than before 1970. Is that enough? The answer is no. There are still problems to be solved. We should be looking at fields and see why is field X not making progress? They're not going faster. So my call is that instead of thinking about whether or not there is a stagnation in technology, we should just look at its field, see why is it or is it not broken, and try to come up with solutions. It might be that there is a single cause for all of these problems. Some people, for example, Eli Dorado on Twitter, he has argued, and Tyler Cowan as well, that it may be, and Peter Thiel as well, there is this idea that there is a generalized complacency in society, that we in general, we're getting more complacent. And this happens in government, and it happens everywhere in general, that we are not trying as hard as we used to fix things, that we are not sufficiently annoyed at the inefficiencies of the world to actually go on and fix stuff. That might be true. I mean, we could discuss to what extent that's true. But I say, even if that's true, there are many problems that still remain. And we should just go forth and tackle them. We should do this road mapping and bottleneck finding exercise, develop plans, and execute on them.
That's a great point. And I think you're absolutely right in that it's less important to figure out why, and why is often overdetermined, but fixing it is the most important thing we can try and work on, and go case by case, because that's the way you can actually solve a problem, is breaking down.
It's like one could see how it is intellectually satisfying to conceptualize and theorize a greater stagnation in technology and think and be able to say yes or no. but like some questions are some like more ill posed than others. Some questions are harder to actually give a straight answer to, or even maybe even if you give an answer, the answer is going to be kind of vague and subject to lots of assumptions. So many assumptions that people will disagree with your assumptions, and then the question is not really answered because it's so assumption dependent.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. That's great. And that's a great segue into, I wanted to move a little bit, talk more about econ and, what do people most misunderstand about the economy of the Soviet Union? I love reading these posts on your blog because, you just hear about in school, the Soviet Union playing economy and like, that's it. And that's glossed over. Right. And you read the Hayek stuff, but, how well did it work? Did it work at all?
Maybe just to give some context about why I wrote these posts, which ended up being a small booklet published by the Adam Smith Institute in the UK. So in Spain, where I'm from, there are a bunch of communist parties. We don't have one. We have a bunch of them. We also have some fascist parties. It's a very interesting place compared to at the scene from the US optics. It's more diverse both ways, and periodically you see some propaganda you could call it reported propaganda depending on what you think from these parties, arguing that actually maybe the Soviet Union was not as bad as you see. Right. But here's the twist. They will back then they had this video showing that the USSR was kind of great, but they used data from sources like the United Nations or the CIA. They did not use Soviet data because people was like, the Soviets were kind of playing with the books and like
right.
And that's an interesting thing, right? Because you'd think that the United Nations and the CIA of all people would have incentives to get it right.
Yeah.
So then I thought, is it real, or is it something going on here, strange going on here? So that was the starting point. Now, when people think about the USSR, there are two or three things that come to mind. One, I guess, is it was a planned economy, meaning that by and large, the economy, not 100% of the economy, but most of the economy was planned by the state. There were the reverse factories, and they had these very galaxy brain engineers trying to do optimization problems to optimally allocate resources across all of these industries. There's a very fun book called Red Plenty that kind of goes over how some of these works.
My sister got me that for Christmas. I haven't gotten into it yet, but she said it's really good.
It's a really fun read. There were these small private markets called Rhinoc. I'm completely butchering the Russian pronunciation, but there is that people could trade, like farm products, like very basic stuff. That maybe if you could, if after queuing for some time you couldn't buy like meat, you could go to the farmer and you could. There's a small amount of free market, but by and large it was a planned economy, and also so it was a planned economy after. This is largely after Stalin's time.
Okay.
Which again leads to the second point. Soviet Union people come to mind. Oh, Stalin, right? Stalin, the gulags, the famines, the Holodomor.
Yeah.
Stalin. So my analysis of the Soviet Union focuses on the Soviet Union at its best. That is on the post-Stalin era. Gotcha. And the reason for this is that if we can show that the USSR was not so great at its best, then by implication, at its worst, was like even worse. Right. And indeed, regarding food, I guess the first interesting thing that I found out is that, first, there were no food scarcity in the Soviet Union after, I think, 1956 or so. I think the idea of these people starving, that's true, but it happened during the earlier stages of the USSR. After that, they didn't really struggle as much with that. After Stalin, that is. But then that's the reason. It's like, okay, well, I mean, maybe it was not North Korea. They did a little bit better than North Korea still. But then you wonder, if you look at the United Nations, there's this entity within the UN called the Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO. And if you look at, they have this time series for calories per person they consumed.
Oh, interesting.
And seemingly, the Soviets were eating more calories than the US, which seems difficult given the US people like to eat a lot of calories and get.
We're good at it.
Yeah, the US it's really good at like all that very nice food, all that nice freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
But at first I thought, well, might it be because Russia is colder than the US? Maybe they need more food for, because it's colder. Yeah. Maybe I thought, well, their economy is less advanced. Maybe that they're doing more hard manual labor. So but I tried to look for some comparisons. That didn't seem to be true. You look at Finland. You look at other countries. The food consumption was still very high, surprisingly.
Interesting.
So then I thought, okay, where does the data came from? Where did the FAO get this data? could it be that it was like Soviet data that was cooked or something?
Yeah.
What's the origin of this data? So then I got into this whole like rabbit hole of this very niche literature of people trying to do calculations based on like how much the Soviets said they produced, and then trying to adjust for like spoilage from the farm to the actual people consuming it, and then trying to calculate how many calories are in a Soviet potato and things like that.
That's awesome.
Because apparently it's different potato has a different amount of calories and things like that,
right.
and so on. And I guess like TLDR, where this goes is that the FAO used, so they took I guess also for context, Soviet data that was published after, more or less after Stalin or even during the later USSR. It's more or less, or it's taken today to be relatively uncooked. It's raw and it's organic. It's not adulterated. So we can more or less trust the data actually.
Oh wow!
But the FAO, well, at the same time, so the Soviets themselves, they have their own estimates of how many calories they were actually consuming. So there is this entity called Goskomstat. This is like a Soviet statistics agency. And their data showed that the Soviets were eating fewer calories compared to the US. So they had their own set of coefficients to convert from Soviet food to like American, to like standardized calories. But the FAO said we're going to trust their food figures, but not their conversion coefficients. So they took the kilograms of things they were eating and used standardized average coefficients that they use for other countries and applied them to the US. And if you dig into that report, they say this kind of wishy-washy, but we had to do something, and like here we go. So that's where that data came from. It's like it's deeply buried into it. I mean, it's like if you just plot it, if you go to their website and plot it, it looks like any other line. It looks like each line in a graph, it's the same line as any other, but each of these lines is telling a story. It's coming from somewhere. It's coming from some random guys in the 70s arguing about potatoes and calories.
Wow, that's amazing. That's awesome. That's really cool. Just imagine you're one of these guys, and this is what you're working on. You're figuring out these Soviet potatoes, and
that's
awesome.
That's kind of the prehistorical mystery, figuring out how many calories you're actually consuming. Another one was finding out claims around that some people saying that the Soviet Union was actually more efficient than the US.
Interesting.
Efficiency, yeah. And then again, this involves lots of very obscure and niche economics, but the TLDR here boils down to what do people mean by efficiency?
Gotcha.
Now, there's one definition of efficiency, which some people call a static efficiency, which is if I give you a bunch of machines and people, and then you can combine them and organize them, think of a whole economy in different ways. You are optimally statically efficient if everything is allocated to their best use. That is, that there is no rearrangement of resources such that as a whole you're producing more. That's the meaning of static efficiency. And dynamic efficiency. So that is. This concept in economics called the its name. It's the PPF, the production possibility frontier. So I guess you could see if you imagine an economy that can produce, let's say, cannons or like butter, and you can choose between both. There is a curve that is like that determines an exchange ratio between both, and you could decide how much you want of each. But the point is that there's a curve of the optimality that you can choose different combinations of outputs, and all of them are optimal. And there's a set of points inside this curve or this surface that are not optimal. So that
gotcha.
That's that. If you rearrange the economy, you could produce more of everything, kind of, if you're in that point. So the dynamic efficiency, on the other hand, dynamic efficiency would be that over time you're actually growing this production possibility frontier, that actually you're able to produce more in general.
Got it.
And the research that seems to show that indeed the Soviet Union was very statically efficient.
Interesting.
Seems surprising at first, and whereas at the same time their dynamic efficiency was low, and overall the productivity that we talked about in the earlier sense, this TFP, that's like a residual of GDP, that was low. The rate of growth in TFP was kind of low. The explanation was that it's an interesting quirk of what happens. What happens is if as an economy your technology doesn't improve very fast, you get good at using what you have.
Oh, you have to use old stuff, right?
Yeah. If you use the same like machines over and over for 20 years, you get good at using them and how everything should be allocated. There is no disruption going on that will force you to change and rearrange things. You can get good at optimizing the here and now instead of be constantly changing things. So indeed, there seems to be some inverse correlation between the more dynamically efficient you are, the less time there is for the economy to adapt and settle to a statically efficient allocation of resources. So ironically, ironically, because they were not that innovative, they were statically efficient.
Wow, that's
It's like,
fascinating.
yeah, it's there, and it's like if you just see the claim on its own freestanding, the USSR was more efficient asterisk statically than the US. It sounds kind of weird, and it seems like scoring points for the USSR, whereas actually it has to be put in its own context as to where that efficiency was actually coming from, which is not very flattering to the USSR.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, and I want to ask you this question. I just had this thought. What do lay people most misunderstand about the economy of the Soviet Union? What would be your takeaway after doing all this research? Just in the discourse,
I mean, in the discourse, if it's like one thing, it's not necessarily the economy, but it's the USSR as a whole. As in, if you ask people what was bad, why was the USSR a problem,
right?
Or what did they do wrong? People will talk about political persecution and gulags and Stalin,
right?
And those things, and they will maybe it's like not think much about the idea or the problems with a planned economy in the first place. On the other hand, perhaps like even people that. Some was like, oh, it was a planned economy. Of course, it had to collapse. Of course, it didn't work. I mean, it's like it kind of worked in the sense that Russia was a very poor country. Russia was basically a feudal agricultural economy that then Stalin took into something that could actually defeat the Germans at World War II, which is it's something.
It's impressive.
It doesn't mean that it couldn't have been achieved by other means. And there's some research on that. I think what would have happened had Russia became a capitalist country instead of without having to go into communism. But yeah, there's something to that as well. Although even then, we could say that the one reason why they could grow so fast is that, again, going back to this framework of thinking about growth, you have people, capital, and productivity. The Soviets basically. There's this idea of forced savings. That is that you can force more people. You can artificially restrict consumption. When you have a planned economy, you can force people not to consume and to save more, which is what they did, and then put all that into investment. You can insist like no more like fancy organic humus for you. We're going to put this into making steel and concrete to make more factories and make more stuff.
Gotcha.
That's how they got a lot of growth. But the thing is that there's only so much steel and concrete you can manufacture to make more steel and concrete factories. There's only so much investment. The share of investment in the USSR GDP was kind of it was not that high, but even then. They were throwing at investment way more than the US. I think they were 30 or 35% of all the economy was investment. In the US right now, it might be like 20-something%, which means that if you look at consumption, if you also couple this with the fact that the USSR, when trying to match the US military, they were spending, I think, twice as percent of GDP in military compared to the US because they were a smaller economy. If you take the investment and the military expenditures during the Cold War, you end up with that actually consumption, as in how much people are actually consuming, is way less than you expect from just looking at GDP directly.
Gotcha. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. So I wanted to scoot now and talk about Cuba. So, high human development index in Cuba. Is this a mirage? Is this a real effect? What do you think?
Yeah, so I guess first we should define what the HDI is, the Human Development Index. So this is an index that it's basically a geometric mean. This is basically taking the cubic root over the multiplication of three things. These three things being indices of life expectancy, GDP, and years of education. As in, on average, how many years do the people in society get of education? Now, if at least a few years ago, if you looked at this is elaborated by the UN, so it's not like it's done by some shady communist cabal. It's something that seems kind of legit. And this is something that people will typically use as an indicator to compare how well different countries are doing, as kind of like a all things considered scorecard, under the premise that well, maybe some countries have high GDP just because they have oil or something, so you want to consider other things other than GDP.
Right.
Now, the extent to which this weighting of these things, throwing them in there, is reasonable, that's perhaps somewhat questionable, but it's an index that it's out there. Now, 3 or 4 years ago, if you looked at these HDIs for Latin America, Cuba was the second highest, which seems surprising given that Cuba has an interesting political system.
Absolutely.
And they wonder, well, where is it coming from? Is it that it kind of works? Is it that they have something that we don't know about healthcare and education and economic growth? Well, I guess if you have like two I think two useful frameworks that they have when thinking about economics in general is what they call thinking in time and space. That is, take the country and compare with other countries around it, and then take the country and think of the country across time. So in this case, like, okay, how do countries around Cuba doing? How are they doing? And also Cuba itself, prior to the revolution, which was in 1959, how was it doing? Could it be that actually it began it was actually a very nice place to begin with, and then it kind of just cruised along?
Yeah, and got some momentum.
Yeah, and indeed that seems to be the case for education and lifespan. That even back prior to the revolution, they were already scoring extremely high on these metrics. These might be due to a variety of factors. It might be culture, I guess. In the same sense, for example, if you look at life expectancy of Hispanics in the U.S., if you compare, let's say, non-Hispanic whites with Hispanics in the U.S., Hispanics are poorer than the average American, but Hispanics live longer than whites. Even I think even more than the richest of whites. Now, why is this? People are it's like, how could it be, given that they have worse healthcare or whatever, they cannot access or that uninsured, whatever? How could this be? So some people argue that maybe it's something about culture, about that maybe it's a combination of better diet and exercise and better community and family relations. Who knows? But it might be that something like that may also be behind Cuba. But in any case, if you take, for example, something I did, which is to take 1955, prior to the revolution, you take all these indicators for Cuba and a bunch of other countries around it, and then you plot, and then you take the same indicators in, I think, 2013 or some recent year, and then you see, of course, countries that started from a higher point are, even to this day, more or less, they have retained that very high standard of living-ish in terms of like this education and lifespan. And if you look at Cuba, you see, like, does Cuba look special in these charts? Or does it more or less fall in line? And it largely falls in line to some extent. So that could be used to explain healthcare, lifespan and years of education. But there are other things that are not explained by that. One would be GDP. And another one here is a bit of an anecdote. One thing that in poor countries drags, I think, lifespan down is infant mortality.
Got it.
It's like historically lifespan has been relatively low because there was very high child mortality like very early on. So Cuba, as it happens, that due to the way they do their statistics, they do not count deaths between birth and a few days. They don't count.
Gotcha.
So in the calculations, they are not they don't appear there.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of like an interesting, which again, if you look at a table with data, you would think that its number is coming from with the same place, but not quite. There's stories behind each number. Going back to the before. GDP was also a tricky one. So GDP, conceptually, it's a grab bag of all the economic activity in an economy. But to compare GDP, let's say, if you take, I guess, this more recent debate, if you compare the GDP between two countries, what did you do? Let's say the GDP of Cuba and the GDP of the US. You could take, let's say, the GDP of Cuba in pesos, the currency, and then convert it using the exchange rate to dollars, and compare dollars, let's say the US GDP in dollars to Cuban GDP in dollars, and compare them. That's okay-ish, but you can do better than that, which is why people use this approach that's called purchasing power parity. Philosophically, the idea of this is that $1 or whatever $1 is in pesos doesn't buy you the same amount of stuff. Or to put it in a different sense, $100,000 is the same in San Francisco and it's the same in the middle of Texas, but you don't have the same life.
Right, exactly.
In San Francisco, you will share a room and you will pay a lot of money, whereas in Texas, you will have a very nice house with a pool and 3 bedrooms for the same amount.
Yep.
So people try to look at individual prices within each of these economies and try to use those to make corrections to see how rich they actually are, how much these economies actually can quote buy with all this GDP. This is philosophically more difficult to do than just using exchange rates, and because of these methodological problems, you again find very obscure conceptual disputes about what's the best way of doing this. So again, back then, looking at this HDI, looking at the GDP that was behind the number, I was like, okay, where does the GDP number is coming from? So then you go into this not that old, this report from the World Development Bank that has that they were estimating. They were explaining the methodology for comparing prices and applying these corrections to the GDP. And they said, for Cuba, we are offering this number, but don't take it too seriously because we haven't really settled on a good way. Like we cannot, it's a planned economy. There are prices that they're not as comparable as they are with the market economy. So we have to do some more corrections. Here's a preliminary figure, but don't trust it too much. What the United Nations do is like, let's put the number in the HDI.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah, it's like, they learned. I think the HDI changed recently. I think now instead of being the second highest, now it might be the 7th or the 9th. So it just went down to where I think it's relatively. It's still high, right? It's not like it's super low, but again, it's high partly because of this pre-existing good state of healthcare and education. But yeah, so that's kind of another case where one wants to look behind the story that's in the data, that just because it's on a table and it sits with everything else doesn't mean it's as reliable as the other pieces of data. And it was kind of like a fun detective story to just go figuring out where all these numbers are coming from and seeing all these debates of people bickering about all these obscure figures.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's really interesting. And it's a reminder you've always got to be careful, right? You always got to be careful. Interesting. I wanted to move on a little bit now. So last week on the podcast, we talked to Freddie DeBoer. Have you ever read his blog, his book, Cult of Smart?
I have not, but I think I've heard a podcast with him which more or less he outlines the ideas behind the book.
Yeah. He's a pretty interesting guy. Anyway, we talked about direct instruction and Bloom's 2 sigma problem. Could you just describe it and how robust do you think it is?
Yeah. So Bloom's 2 sigma problem. This idea that this psychologist, educational psychologist Bloom, that found that he was trying to find good ways of improving education, of teaching in general. How do you get kids, not only kids at all levels, to learn more and better? And he found that the best thing that you could do is tutoring, one-to-one individualized tutoring, having one person that understands how you think and what you know and can give you individualized feedback and individualized homework and so on and so forth.
Right.
This leads to looking at test scores in exams to a 2 sigma improvement. And 2 sigma here is 2 standard deviations, which we can just interpret as a very large effect. It's like 2 sigmas, we can just take that to be as the big effect problem.
Exactly.
It's a big effect problem because in education research, if you look at randomized controlled trials of various interventions that people have tried, most of them, their effect size is close to 0.
Tiny. Yep.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult to improve education. And so the Bloom's 2 sigma problem is very interesting in that it seems to show there's something that seemingly increases education a lot. And so that is as measured by scores. Now, Bloom, he said, like, okay, can we replicate this 2 sigma that we get from tutoring in a scalable way? Because, giving everyone a personal tutor is very expensive.
Right.
Can we do this in a cheaper way? So that was the 2 sigma problem. And he proposed that we could do it with various combinations of techniques. I think the most famous one is something called mastery learning, which is a technique whereby you really hammer down on concepts until they're really appropriately acquired, and only then you build on and teach more. I guess as an example would be if you're teaching, let's say, summation and then multiplication, you don't just go through and then if someone doesn't really get how to do 9 plus 9, just keep going. You don't care. With mastery learning, you just stop and test and test and test and teach and test until it's mastered, and only then you move on. The idea being that when concepts are not solid, they're difficult to then
build on.
Build on and acquire. So it's less efficient and people fall behind and so on. So I think the headline 2 sigma for tutoring, there might be something there. Maybe it's not 2 sigma, maybe it's 1.6, maybe it's 1.5, but definitely the idea that tutoring can greatly improve outcomes, it's real. That's definitely there. Mastery learning as well, I think, again, not 2 sigma, but to some extent, yes, it also works. The way in which works, or there are various channels through which it could work. One is simply repeated exposure to the same information over and over. This is the space repetition effect. And this is when you have, for example, flashcards to learn a new language, where you basically you ask yourself, okay, this is a word, what does it mean? And then if you failed, you will see this card more often and so on. Another way in which this could work is something called the testing effect, which is merely by testing you, even if I don't give you the answer, that in itself apparently helps you remember.
Got it.
Being forced to ask yourself an answer for yourself apparently helps retention as well.
Right.
And probably just conceptually, this idea, the idea of building on solid knowledge helps. I guess because cognitively, if I give you a concept you don't understand, that you may try to ground it in other things, but if those things are shaky, it's difficult to know where it fits, and maybe you don't really acquire or your brain will be like, oh, this thing doesn't really make sense, so I just throw it away,
right?
And you just keep going, and you don't really learn as much. There are some suggestions. Some people have suggested using software methods to achieve these effects. Famously, there was this program that DARPA funded that is called the Digital Tutor project, and basically it was in the context of training U.S. Navy IT technicians. To try to show it works not just in a high school setting or like K-12, and they showed like very impressive effects. They showed that the students I think in half the time that the regular course takes were achieving scores way higher than anything that the regularly taught students could achieve, which is kind of cool, given that this is software, which means that maybe it can be scaled, that maybe you could greatly increase the efficiency of education, not in general, across the entire country, just with software. Software, it may be difficult, and actually in this literature of doing it in software, it's a common theme that it's very difficult to program this software, because you need both knowledge about, you need to build a system that can model the student, what they know, how they learn, have a bank of questions, and to generate the right questions that they can fill in the gaps they have. And also you need domain experts about math or physics or whatever to actually build in that knowledge. But difficult as it might be to do it once, because ultimately the knowledge that's taught in many contexts, it's more or less relatively stable. And so you could plausibly benefit from that. Direct instruction. So now you mentioned that direct instruction. So direct instruction is a technique, educational technique typically practiced in a special education context for kids with mental disabilities that have slower rate of learning. And the idea here is maybe taking us a step back first to explain. If we could say that there is a philosophy of education that some people may think of as conservative, in that the teacher knows and the student, basically the student is a vessel that has to be filled with knowledge by the teacher.
Gotcha. Right.
It's unidirectional. A more what we call progressive view of education is it's a view that sounds like the teacher and the student learn together, that the teacher is a guide that the student uses to progress through knowledge, perhaps at their own pace, and in some cases to explore areas of their own interest. In a less, quote, authoritarian way. Direct instruction is the extreme version of the first approach, in which you have a strong emphasis on things like rote memorization, repetition. If there are videos of direct instruction on YouTube, and it looks initially a bit like a cult. So you have like just saying 9 times 9 is 81. The case is like 9 times 9 is 81. 1 plus 1 is 2. 1 plus 1 is 2. It seems very weird. But then it's like, well, ultimately, does it work? That's the question. So the direct instruction guys, they seem to be very interested in seeing if it works or not. As in they try to, when the curriculum, when their concept gets implemented, they try to see how the school that is using it does, and they try to use that knowledge to then improve the direct instruction method, and then send that knowledge to other. I guess in the same way that Tesla can gather video from all the Tesla cars and use that video to improve all the Teslas, the direct instruction institute, they try to use knowledge when they deploy EDI to improve the method. So various tests that are around for the I actually think the evidence seems to show that it seems to work. And again, especially for the special needs case, that works relatively well there. And it works probably somewhat better than, quote, this more carefree education method, I guess. But then there's some debate as to in which way it works, right? Because I guess it's easy to show that it works if you care about, if education is about learning a bunch of facts, and you're going to test it on those facts. If you test that, I think direct education is more likely to win. But then some people argue, but what about creativity and others like other things that are more difficult to test? They're difficult to measure indeed, and who knows? But if you have like a more limited set of concepts, that may well work. I think and And the reason why the reconstruction hasn't been, actually, I think the US did years past, like decades ago, one nationwide huge trial of all these different education systems, all the way from the reconstruction to literally letting kids be kids and do whatever they want. I don't know, I think the name of this, it's on my blog. There's untitled.com/Bloom Sigma. And I'm sure it works, seemingly, that this reconstruction thing seems to work. Now, a reason why maybe this has not been adopted might be that culturally or politically, ideologically, or from a values point of view, the reconstruction is everything. Is everything teachers stand against, like this idea. I guess their self-image. They don't want to be almost robots or reduced to just following a script, because ultimately, I think the reconstruction, if some teachers are better than others, they will try to get good teachers to write a script of what good teachers do and how they act. And then like actors, they will try to get teachers to act like the best teachers that they have found. The idea being that acting like a good teacher is sufficient to be a good teacher. Now, some teachers find that this is dehumanizing to some extent, that being forced to just play act or like LARP, literally being a teacher and just following this very rigid script. And they just don't like it. They don't like, as a job, doing that. This a combination of that plus the philosophy underlying this idea that they are just like throwing knowledge at kids. They don't like that concept. They like, and I guess like at some level it kind of sounds nice in some way. This idea that you're going to just guide them and you are their partner. You are not here and they are down there. You are more of an equal to them.
No hierarchy.
Yeah,
it's kind of heartwarming.
I guess some people find that structure appealing or very satisfying to think of education in those egalitarian terms, but it doesn't seem to work. I think that
exactly
so it happens that ultimately there's a difference between doing what you think seems okay or satisfying to you and doing what works and and it's and then it's like ultimately, it's, I guess the meta question would be at which level in the policy in education policy hierarchy would you have to intervene such that to get this or would the teachers unions just rebel against you and it's just completely possible to do? I don't know.
Exactly. Tough to tell. That's really interesting. So I had one final line of questioning, and I want to ask you about longevity research. So it seems like it's a field which is very prone to getting, shall we say, quacks that, it's very muddy. It can be very muddy. So where do you think we are right now, like as of today, as of, February 10th, 2021 in aging research?
So I guess first, we don't quite understand, or the broad question of what is aging, that remains sadly unsolved. There's some theories that I think they are better than the old theories. So for example, back a few years ago, people would talk about telomeres, for example,
right, that was the big thing.
Or antioxidants. I think if you remember a few years ago, everything was all about the antioxidants, right?
Yeah.
Now those things have fell out of the fashion, and people are thinking more about the epigenome, for example, or accumulation of damage, or things like that. There are like various schools of thought about aging. But I guess ultimately we know that aging can be, the things we don't know, that aging can be regulated. That is it's not fixed. That you can take a worm, let's say, or a fly, or a mouse, and you can like play with these genes and make it live. In worms, 10x longer, 10 times longer, just by, I think, knocking out, just by inactivating two genes, you can make a worm live 10 times longer. In mice, I think this is up to 50% longer than the regular lifespan, which is not bad.
Yeah.
And in monkeys, which is the closest to us, I think was like maybe 10% increase in lifespan. In this case, the technique they used was, which again, the most conserved and best understood intervention with longevity. The thing that you see that has the same mechanisms in yeast, in flies, in worms, in mice, and in humans. Humans, we assume, we have it in monkeys, is those that center around the so-called nutrient sensing pathways. These are routes or like sets of proteins that work together that detect nutrient availability. That is basically when you are starving, they trigger responses such that ultimately you end up going to some kind of maintenance mode that makes you live longer. And this mechanism seems to be very well conserved throughout the life in general. and there's some evolutionary theorizing as to why is this the case in the first place. I think this is the logic behind, for example, fasting. It's these mechanisms.
Gotcha.
And so that's one. There are some drugs that have been proposed that can directly mimic because ultimately caloric restriction, as improper caloric restriction, can be mentally exhausting.
Very difficult.
Feel cold.
Right.
You feel cold. You feel hungry all the time. So,
right.
There is this drug called rapamycin that also seems to extend lifespan in everything. So if you get rapamycin to something, everything gets better. Like, and in clinical trials in mice like Alzheimer's and cancer, everything seems to improve. It's kind of like, which I guess if there is something that people would more or less point as to what is aging. Aging is a set of things. How they connect to each other is another matter, but a set of things that if that affect everything else more or less. That
Got it.
I guess for example, if you could, the cause of let's say cardiovascular disease is that the accumulation of cholesterol or excess cholesterol in your arteries, it clogs our arteries and so forth. But that's just there. Cholesterol is not accumulating in your colon or in your brain.
Right.
But aging, so it's very limited in its scope to one system. But aging seems to be the same mechanisms that can regulate maintenance and repair damage response everywhere in all cells. That's one way of thinking about aging. There is, I guess, one of the interesting new developments in just like measuring aging. That is, can we predict from, I guess, if you give me, let's say, a blood sample, can you predict how old the person is? Can you predict how long they have to live?
Oh man!
So this is the theory behind the so-called methylation or epigenetic clocks.
Right.
Is this idea that we have DNA, and then in the DNA there are these small methyl. So methyl, it's basically one carbon, 3 hydrogens.
Yeah.
If you had one more, for it will be methane. But methyl is just for 3 that gets attached to the DNA, and that's a methylation mark. It can be on or off in one given site. It's like 0, 1 kind of.
Gotcha.
And if you sequence. If you look at these methylation patterns, in this case, you take them from T cells in blood. Typically, if you look at this and you train very, very simple or almost linear regression models to predict remaining lifespan or actual chronological age, you can do a decent job. And I guess an example of how decent this job is. Well, suppose that I could choose between that. I want to predict your lifespan, and I can choose between asking you 2 questions. I can ask you, do you smoke or not? Or I can ask you, give me your blood. I want to see your epigenetic clock. I would rather see your blood. That's the.
Oh, really? Interesting.
These clocks predict more than smoking, non-smoking status.
Oh, wow.
Which is quite interesting because then they mean, okay, these methylation marks in the DNA in these systems, what do they mean? There are 3 schools of thought here that are currently they're dishing out exactly to what extent each of them are right. There is some interesting work being done by Morgan Levin at Yale on figuring out what the clocks mean. Basically, there are these 3 theories. One is it's noise. That is that at random we get extra or we get more or less of these methylation marks, and that causes some kind of damage, so on and so forth. Second theory is that those things are just a damage response. Actually, they are not causal, but actually there's damage accumulating elsewhere, and then the body tries to switch on damage responses, and those things are the things that you are seeing in the methylome. The third one is it's an interesting one. This one is what some people call the Quasi-Program theory of aging.
Oh yeah.
And what it goes is that all this aging stuff, it's not that damage accumulates randomly, it's that your body wants you to age. Really? That the same kind of processes that take you from being a child to being an adult also keep pushing you from an adult to actually eventually dying.
Interesting.
This also goes by the name the hyperfunction theory of aging.
That's interesting.
Which is an interesting take, because if aging is a regulated process, it means that maybe we can switch back these clocks and just like if aging just means that these methyls at positions 1 and 3 and 10 they are switched off. What if you switch them on? What happens? That has not been done yet, but I expect we will see similar experiments to that at some point. We'll actually try to causally intervene in the epigenome to see what these methylation marks actually mean. There are some other interesting developments in the aging world, like this used to go by the name of probiosis, popularized by the idea of blood boys. This idea that you can, if you take young blood and put them into old people, they get somehow better in some regards.
Right.
This was done. It was done in mice, so you can basically take like an all-magic mice and literally connect them together, literally see them together, like science used to be. There's like a long list of mad science experiments I've seen. This is not even the craziest one I've seen. There's this crazy experiment, like unrelated, where there's this gland called the thymus. This gland we have around here in the chest, and mice also have thymus, and then these guys start to see, what if we implant like 24 of these glands in one mice? And they began to like put 24 of them to see what happens. It's like,
what are you doing? That's awesome. That's funny.
Yeah, this is what happens when you fund people on the projects. They just go mad and do weird things. But it was an actually useful experiment. Yeah. So and with the blood thing, we actually discovered we started to understand why is it that this works? Why is it that both, I think, both taking blood out, that is that if you are relatively old and you donate blood, that actually seems to have a rejuvenating effect, surprisingly.
It's really weird.
Because it dilutes potential misfolded proteins and things that just accumulate in your blood that you cannot get rid of. Gotcha. So maybe these old school guys that were about bloodletting and leeches, maybe they're into something.
That's fascinating.
And conversely, others have argued that maybe you can isolate what's called young blood plasma factors from like things that are more abundant in young blood that are not in old blood. Maybe we can use those and then just like figure out what they are, isolate them, produce them, manufacture them at scale, and then you could just get a simple injection of those. This is very cheap to produce. All these procedures are very cheap, and that could potentially. There's some experiments in mice doing this, and it also looks very promising.
Got it.
And yeah, so there's that. And I think also something that we'll probably begin to see at some point soon is the idea of combined intervention. There seems to be more and more calls to do combinations.
Got it.
For example, I guess an example would be here, this idea that if you could cure cancer tomorrow, just like all cancer is gone.
Yeah.
By how much would life expectancy increase?
Oh, that's a great question. How much would it?
3 or 4 years, not much.
3 or 4 years. Gotcha.
So suppose you could cure cardiovascular disease. The answer is similar. It's 3 or 4 years.
3 or 4 years. Gotcha.
It's just because all of these diseases tend to occur at the same time. So if it's not cancer, it will be your heart. If it's not your heart, it will be your lungs.
Right.
So basically, even if, so suppose that you can only die of cancer and of cardiovascular disease. Suppose that if you cure both, you live forever, kind of, in a very simplistic model. But even if that's true, just curing one of them will show very small effects in lifespan. Yet, if you tackle many things at once, you will see synergistic effects. Now, this is typically not done in academia because it may be more expensive. It may be more difficult to disentangle what's going on and tell a story about the mechanism and get the paper published. Maybe if your lab is doing telomeres, maybe you don't want to do something in a different field and try this blood thing. Right. But I think we will start to see these combinations. Of a more broad approach to treating disease. So, for example, as a concrete example, if you take arthritis, osteoarthritis, which is produced simply by the mechanical degradation of cartilage in your joints. So just by using them, this cartilage is like soft tissue between bones, and then it wears off until you get bone-on-bone contact, which causes pain and arthritis. And you could, to reduce it, you could, for example, reduce inflammation. You could try to use some stem cell therapies to try to get the cartilage to grow again. That growth is impaired by inflammation. So maybe if you only do stem cells, you don't see much. If you only do inflammation, but if you do both, maybe you see an interesting effect.
Interesting.
And unfortunately, in pharma, partly because of the way clinical trials work, doing outside of cancer, outside of oncology, it's very rare for companies to do combination of interventions. So, for example, if you wanted to combine, let's suppose you want to use a senolytic. So, senolytic targets this thing called senescent cells, which are thought to be behind various diseases or contribute to various diseases like arthritis or macular degeneration in the eye.
Yeah.
If you wanted to use a senolytic and also do a cell therapy at the same time, the FDA will tell in your trial you have to have a control with nothing, one arm for the cell therapy, one arm for senolytic, and one more arm with those two things. So it's a combinatorial explosion of costs.
Right.
So there is the hope that maybe if these clocks, if we can produce more clocks and have better methods or better predictors or easier ways to measure function and changes of these anti-aging therapies without waiting 20 years to see what happens. If we get that, then we can run more and cheaper trials. I guess that's one of the other focus areas for the aging field, to try to find biomarkers that are cheaper and easier to measure, so that we can have more and cheaper trials.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. How close do you think real in the field clinical therapies are?
I mean, they're there already. I mean, actually last year, one of them did a phase 2 trial and failed. So they're slowly getting here, and there are probably senolytics is one of them. There are a bunch of them in various stages of the pipeline, so they are steadily being pushed. So they are not purely hypothetical. And also, if all this blood stuff turns out to be actually accurate, that's an FDA approved procedure. It's called plasmapheresis, and so it could be used. It didn't have to prove safety. It's already safe. It's just like donating blood, right? So you can.
Yeah.
So you could imagine. I think that in the next maybe 10, 20 years, we'll see lots of these therapies coming into the market. Now, this does not mean yet that you can take, let's say, you're 80-year-old and then do like after a week, it's looking like young again. And we are not there yet. But there are some very promising things in the pipeline, and in general in trying to change the way we think about medicine, to try to think instead of separate diseases as more of they actually are very tightly connected, and we can actually target this nexus of disease that we call aging.
That makes a lot of sense, especially since aging seems to feed into all these other issues, right? Your risk for Alzheimer's and dementia and heart disease and cancer all go up as you get older.
Yeah, or going famous with COVID. If you look at excess mortality for COVID, if you look at the under 30s, it's as if nothing, mostly as if nothing happened. Whereas if you look at the elderly, you see way more mortality rates.
Definitely, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Jose, thank you so much for spending the time today. Where can people find you again? Can you plug your blog and where else you'd like to send people?
Yeah, so my blog is nintil.com. That's nintil.com. And I'm also very active on Twitter, on Artirkel. That's ARTR or just like search my name, which is very long, and there's only one person with my name, so you will surely find me.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Goodbye.
All right.